Hi guys, Jimmy McIntyre here and welcome to another episode of Photoshop Secrets. Today I'm going to show you how to stitch difficult panoramas together. And by difficult, I just mean that Photoshop has problems when trying to blend the exposures. And I'm going to show you two different techniques to overcome this challenge. But before we begin, I don't usually advertise my products on YouTube, but I released a course called Mastering Raya Pro in January, and I don't think I've mentioned it on my YouTube channel yet. And essentially, this course will teach you my entire workflow, the steps I take to create the images that you see on my blog through Strange Lenses. And I use Raya Pro, the digital blending panel, throughout my entire workflow. So if you're looking for something else and a step-by-step guide for improving your imagery, then feel free to look into Raya Pro and the new Mastering Raya Pro course. You can see links for both of these in the description of this video on YouTube. Now to continue with the tutorial, this is a panorama I created recently and published on my blog, and it's a 3-tile panorama, which means that I took 3 separate images and stitched them all together to create this panorama. This was actually an easy panorama to create. Photoshop stitched them together very nicely and there was just some distortion to play around with really. But I want to use this image just as a quick example of how to shoot a panorama. One thing that's incredibly important when we're shooting a panorama is that we leave a lot of overlap between the tiles that we shoot. What I mean by that is when we're shooting, let's say I shot 3 tiles here and this is the first tile, this is the second tile, and this is the third tile, and I try to stitch them together in Photoshop. Photoshop will find it very difficult to stitch these tiles together because we're not giving it much information to work with. Where one tile ends, the other tile begins. Instead, in order to give yourself the best opportunity or the best possibility of stitching your tiles together well, it's better to have a lot of overlap. So for example, instead, if we say this yellow line represents our first tile, this could be the first tile we shot, everything in this area here. Then I'll pan my camera around and I'll capture the next tile, which is everything in between the red lines. And as you can see, there's plenty of overlap between the first and second tiles. So when we ask Photoshop to stitch them together, it has a lot of information to work with in order to create that panorama. And then when I shoot the third tile, anywhere in between this blue line, you can see there's a lot of overlap between the third and second tile as well. And like I say, Photoshop had no problem stitching this panorama together. Another good tip is when you're shooting, try not to create a close crop in your composition. For example, here you can see this is where the main object of interest ends, which is this mountain, of course. And we need this sense of completion to complete the composition. But for my first tile, I didn't stop shooting here. I shot much wider. So there are trees along here in the original tile. And the same here. There's much more information in the original tile here. And also at the bottom of the tiles and at the top. And essentially what happens is when we're shooting a very wide panorama, these were all 14 millimeters wide, we're going to have to correct a lot of distortion. And when we correct distortion, we're going to lose information on the outside of our images. So if we just shoot a little bit wider so that we have more information in our images, then when it comes to correcting any distortion, we can just crop information out that we didn't need anyway. And that way we'll still have all of the information that we initially wanted in our final image. In order to shoot panoramas that have less distortion, I recommend using a narrower focal distance. As I mentioned, this was shot at 14 millimeters, so when I stitched the panorama together, there was a lot of distortion to deal with. The narrower the focal distance, the easier the tiles will stick together. But sometimes we just don't have much choice. Sometimes the conditions are changing so quickly, so the clouds can be moving very quickly, that if we try to narrow the focal distance and shoot more tiles, by the time we're finished, the clouds will be in different positions, and even then it'll be harder to stick together. So sometimes we're forced to use a wider focal distance. So what happens if we have our tiles, they're well shot and we're ready to stitch them in Photoshop, but when we do stitch them, Photoshop comes out with all sorts of problems. Well, let's take this image as an example. Here I have one exposure and another exposure. Clearly they look very different. This image was shot just after the sun came up and this was shot just before. But the problem with this image is that I like the sky, we've got enough information in the sky, but I feel like the foreground's a little bit chopped off. I'd like just a little bit more information here. In this exposure, let's say I didn't like the sky, but I do actually like the sky here. I think it's very nice. We have more information in the foreground. You can see in the darker exposure, we've cropped out this rock along here and some of this plant. And in the brighter exposure, you can see we've got more information. So in my final image, what I really want is all of this exposure, but a slightly extended foreground here, just with more information in it, which means I don't want most of this information. I just want the foreground. And please note, I'm going to be using vertical panoramas in these examples, but you can do exactly the same with horizontal panoramas as well. It doesn't make a difference. Now to create the panorama, I'm just going to go to File, Automate, and Photo Merge. And I'm just going to choose Add Open Files because these are the two files I have open in Photoshop, and press OK. Now Photoshop has attempted to stitch the tiles together, and we can see we now have that nice foreground, but unfortunately it's done a kind of strange stitching job here, and I don't blame it because these two exposures are just too different to stitch together. But nevertheless, I still want this image, so what can I do to stitch these two together? Now I should mention that Photoshop isn't the only software that can create panoramas. There are lots of different programs out there that can probably do a better job than Photoshop. For example, there's free software, and I think it's pronounced Hugen or Hugen, I have no idea, but it's a very good piece of panorama software and you can download it completely free. But since this is a Photoshop tutorial, let's look at how we can fix this. And you'd be surprised at how easy it is. Firstly, I'm just going to delete that. And what I'm actually going to do is crop this image all the way down and just use some of the information that I need. So I'm going to bring it down to around there. Now, we still have a lot of overlap for Photoshop to work with. Where we've cropped, you can see we have the top of this plant to the right, and we have the top of the plant here. And we have lots more information for Photoshop to connect the dots and blend these two exposures. So now I'm going to click on my cropped image and I'm going to save it. And I'll save it to my desktop. And when that's done, I can just go to File, Automate just as before, Photo Merge, Add Open Files, and press OK. And now this time, Photoshop has done a much better job of stitching the two exposures together. Earlier, when we saw the poor stitching around the sunset area, you can see that's really clean now because most of this just comes from one exposure. And Photoshop has only used the cropped image for the foreground there. And so the stitching looks much more natural and much better. So all you need to do in situations similar to this where Photoshop is causing a little bit of a headache, just try cropping one of the images. And it could come out with a much cleaner, much better scene like this. And I'll just crop the bottom down here. And so this is the image before, and this is the image after we stitched the two together. And there's not a huge amount of difference, but it is a good example of how this process can work. Now I'm going to demonstrate you a second way to deal with difficult panoramas. Sometimes Photoshop stitches them really nicely, so they're nice and smooth, but it distorts some areas of the image, which isn't great. For example, if I use these two exposures, which I shot a couple of days ago in Lake Tekapo, I can go to File, Automate, Photo Merge, and again, Add Open Files and press OK. Now Photoshop has finished stitching the two tiles together, and it's done a good job in terms of blending them smoothly, but it's completely distorted the foreground here and the church. Here's the original foreground, which is quite nice. The rocks look quite natural, and here it looks kind of stretched and pushed out, and it's suffering from some serious perspective distortion. The great thing is, with this particular image, it's relatively simple to sort out. We could use adaptive wide angle or lens corrections or manually correct the distortion, but sometimes our panoramas aren't as easy as this. And we're dealing with maybe 5 or 6 tiles, and trying to correct them all after they're stitched is much more difficult. I'm just going to close this and I'm going to duplicate this window. The reason why is I'm going to show you the technique we've just looked at where we crop the image, and you'll see that it doesn't work with this particular scene. So I'm just going to press OK. I'm just going to use the sky from this exposure and put it on top of there. And again, I'm going to save this and go to Filter, Automate, Photo Merge, and Add Open Files. And this time we don't want this exposure, we just want the copy. And I'm going to press OK. So now that Photoshop has finished stitching it this way, you can see it's just as bad, if not worse, than previously. And the reason why is because Photoshop is basically saying, okay, this is our base exposure. And this exposure, we're going to stitch to the bottom of it. But since this is the base exposure, Photoshop is going to keep this the way it is, all the distortion, and it's going to manipulate and morph this exposure to fit this one. And since this has more distortion, then that means this exposure will have more distortion too. And we come out with something like this. So the key to fixing this, and this is a technique I use with almost all of my most difficult panoramas, is just to fix the distortion before stitching. And there are so many different ways to do that. Most people know how to do that through lens corrections or through adaptive wide angle. And if you've never used adaptive wide angle, please look at the description in this video on YouTube to find a link to a video where I show you how to use it very effectively. But since most people know how to use that, I'm going to use a different method instead. I'm going to press Command and T or Control and T, and I'm going to right click and choose Perspective. Then, since the perspective distortion is going inwards like this, essentially we need to stretch out the top parts of the image. And we're just going to keep going until it's really crazy. When that's done, obviously the image looks far too flat. So to make it more natural, we right click on our image and choose Distort. And then we just drag our exposure up until the church looks normal. And I'd say about there. And I'm just going to drag it a little bit down just so it looks a little bit better. And press OK. Now don't worry if it's gone off the screen like that, it's still there. We just need to choose the crop tool and just crop up to get that beautiful Milky Way and some of the church there. And just as with the last image, you can see there's a lot of overlap between exposures. There's more than 40% here between these two tiles. So now this is done and we've corrected a lot of the distortion, we can go to File and Save, and I can save this again to my desktop. And when it's finished, we just go to File, just as we've done the last few times, Photo Merge and Add Open Files, and press OK. And now Photoshop has finished stitching the tiles together. You can see we have far less distortion. The foreground and the rocks look great and very natural, and the church itself looks very natural too. And I'll just crop this down a little bit. We don't want it to be too much of the sky, and just press OK. And so now we have a much more natural scene. And I use this technique with the vast majority of panoramas that I have difficulty with, where I've shot really wide. So if you look on my blog, you'll see Dubai light trails, where I've shot above the amazing intersection, and I corrected all of those tiles beforehand. Or you can see my Guilin image with the clouds, and I'm above the clouds and the mountains. And Photoshop really didn't like stitching that together. So I corrected the files beforehand so that they just fit nicely together, just like a jigsaw puzzle. And that's all for this tutorial. I feel like I've been talking a lot, and when I first started this video series, I was supposed to be creating quick Photoshop secrets, but the secrets seem to be getting longer and longer every time. So I hope you don't mind the longer videos. And just in case you missed it, I created a new video series called Photo Talk, where I talk about some of the theory behind shooting and post-processing. So if you go over to my YouTube channel, you'll see the latest video in this series, which talks about how important darkness is in our composition and how it controls the viewer's eyes. Until then, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.